Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more seconds so that everybody can log on. Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Jennings. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the CEO of Lambda Legal. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon to discuss the election results and where we go from here. Before we launch into that presentation, though, I want to acknowledge the passing of a great leader for the LGBTQ plus community and everyone living with HIV, who's also a very good friend of Lambda Legal, Cornelius Baker. Let's take a moment to remember Cornelius. Good afternoon. Many of us a week ago today were startled, surprised, upset, felt many different kinds of emotions when the election results came in. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The results of the election are going to make Lambda Legal's work much more difficult for the next 4 years. That is simply a reality. But the purpose of today's call is to help you understand that we have been planning for the possibility of this happening for months, and we do indeed have a plan, and we are ready. If we go to the next slide, please. One of my personal heroes is the great British parliamentarian Tony Benn, who is famous for saying there is no final victory as there is no final defeat. While the forces of equality definitely experienced a defeat last Tuesday, it is not final and we are not finished. Next slide, please. Let me take you back to Lambda Legal's founding in 1973. And I want to acknowledge that no two historical moments are exactly the same, but there are lessons we can learn from history. Can you tell I was once a high school history teacher? So we're going to start with a little history lesson. Next slide, please. When Lambda Legal was founded, the state of New York rejected our application to be a charity, saying that our cause was neither benevolent nor charitable. So we had to sue for our own right to exist. And when we were successful, the New York Times did not think it was a terribly big deal. This is the total amount of coverage they gave us. Next slide, please. We were working in a deeply hostile world. 43 of 50 states still criminalized same-sex relationships. We were criminals in over 80% of the country. Lambda Legal immediately made repealing these laws, so-called sodomy laws, a high priority for our early work. It didn't always go well. Next slide, please. Many of you will remember that in 1986, the first time the Supreme Court took up this matter in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, we lost. And the court ruled that criminalizing same-sex relationships was constitutional and legal. But we didn't quit. We didn't give up. We got back to work. Next slide, please. And in 2003, at the very same Supreme Court, in a case called Lawrence versus Texas, we overturned the Bowers versus Hardwick decision, and we put an end to sodomy laws in America. Next slide, please. On July 3rd, 1981, this article appeared in the New York Times. It turned out to be the first New York Times article addressing a disease that would become known as AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. All of us who were alive then remember what came next. Our community was devastated. Our community was decimated. Next slide, please. In fact, in the city of New York alone, more people died of AIDS between 1981 and 1995 than the total number of American soldiers killed in the Vietnam War. Since the appearance of that article in 1981, over 500,000 gay men have died of AIDS in America. Lambda Legal did not give up. Lambda Legal did not quit. Lambda Legal fought back. Next slide, please. And in 1983, we won the first decision protecting people with HIV from discrimination in the People versus 49th West 12th Street Tenant Corp in New York. Next slide, please. In 2003, Massachusetts became the first state in America to allow same-sex couples to marry, in a case called Goodridge versus the state of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. America did not take this news well. If you look at this bar graph, you can see a rapid escalation in the number of states that passed same-sex marriage bans between 2004 and 2008. So that by the end of 2008, next slide, please, all of these red states in the country had constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. Lambda Legal did not give up. Lambda Legal did not quit. We went back to work. And as you probably know, 7 years later, next slide, please, we were victorious in the Obergefell versus Hodges case, which made marriage equality the law of the land. This moment is not exactly like any of those moments. We will face unique and unprecedented challenges. But I want to remind you of this organization's history as one of resilience, as one of determination, as one of persistence and perseverance, and as one of ultimate victory. Next slide, please. I'm sorry to say we have seen the Trump movie before at Lambda Legal. During the first term of President Trump's tenure, we filed 14 cases against the Trump administration. We won 12 of the 14. That's an 86% win rate. We know how to fight this fight, and we know how to win. And I will promise you this: we will not win every fight, but we will fight, and we will fight hard. To talk about how we're going to be fighting, I'm going to turn the microphone over to two of my colleagues. First of all, our Chief Legal Officer, Jenny Pizer, and second of all, Kristine Kippins, our Deputy Legal Director for Policy based in DC. I believe Kristine has the mic first. Oh, I forgot to close with one of my quotes that I really like. Everybody at Lambda Legal knows I love my quotes, and they know that I love John Lewis, who is one of my great heroes. At the depths of the first Trump term, next slide, please, he tweeted this out, and we have framed copies of this tweet in every Lambda Legal office. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Good trouble. And we plan to get into a lot of trouble over the next 4 years. Kristine and Jenny, take it away.
Yeah, Kevin, I think if you wanted to actually introduce a key thing we hope people will be thinking about as Kristine and I outline where we are and the work ahead, that
Yes.
will
Thank you.
set us up to make the case here.
Yeah, I'll come back to this later in the slideshow as well. But we have announced the goal of raising $1 million for an emergency response fund to deal with what we know will be coming. So we have our plans. We need resources to execute those plans. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the slideshow. But for now, let's hear about the plans.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kristine Kippins. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm Lambda's Deputy Legal Director for Policy, working from our office here in Washington, D.C. I'll be walking you through some of the most important takeaways from the election as we know them. The results I'll be sharing are as of this morning. So let's get into them. Next slide, please. I'll begin with the federal landscape, which, I'll be frank, isn't great for people who believe in equality, equity, and justice. Donald J. Trump has won enough electoral college votes to be named president-elect, and Republicans have won a majority of seats in the U.S. Senate. So Democrats failed to retain 4 Senate seats in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Montana. So as it stands right now, Republicans have 53 seats in the Senate for at least the next 2 years, and the Democrats hold 47. These two certainties mean that Trump will be able to fast track political and judicial appointments like he did during the first 2 years of his first term. Next slide, please. We're still awaiting final results of the US House. Democrats would need to flip a net of 4 seats to gain control. Right now, Republicans have actually net gained 1 seat with 16 races yet to be determined. Whoever controls the House controls House committee agendas, and they control the floor, what gets voted on. So if Republicans do maintain control of the House, they will set the agenda, and there will be a Republican trifecta at the federal level. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our worst fears will come true. We still have to see what the margin will be in terms of either party's control and what results were like in districts. There will be room for advocacy here. So let's not give up hope before we know all of the results of the election. Next slide, please. I know many, if not all of us on this call, were disappointed and disturbed by the overall results of the election, but there is some cause for celebration. For the first time in this country's history, there will be 2 Black women senators serving at the same time, each of whom is their state's first Black female senator. We have Angela Alsobrooks from Maryland and Lisa Rochester Blunt of Delaware, who is also the first woman Delaware has sent to the Senate, period. Andy Kim will be the first Korean American to ever serve in the Senate. Emily Randall will be the first out member of Congress to represent Washington State. Julie Johnson will be the first out member of Congress representing folks from the South. And Sarah McBride, representing the at-large district of Delaware, will be our first out trans person elected to Congress. And I want to make sure that we have time to be joyful about that. Now, as we know, storytelling is the most powerful tool in an advocate's toolkit, as are peer-to-peer conversations. And with these advocates in the halls of Congress sharing their own stories with their colleagues, we do have more power than we did before. Next slide. The federal story isn't the only story told on an election night, and I want to acknowledge some of the direct democracy efforts in the states that succeeded during this election. We went 3 for 3 on marriage equality efforts. California, Colorado, and Hawaii repealed bans or limits on same-sex marriage in their state constitutions. Abortion rights were secured in 6 states, including states that went for Trump. New York passed an amendment that provides that people cannot be denied rights based on their ethnicity, national origin, age or disability, or sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive health care and autonomy. And we had some wins for economic justice. Unfortunately, though, Nebraska did choose to ban abortion after the first trimester, and unnecessary xenophobic citizenship voting requirements passed in all 8 states that had such measures on the ballot. Next slide, please. Several governors and state legislators were up for election this year. Government trifectas, where the government and the state legislature are all of the same parties, honestly didn't change that much after this election. Trifectas tend to yield a lot of new laws passed as long as the majority party is on the same page. So we can expect more anti-equality measures to come out of the red states shown on the map here. Minnesota, the only undecided state on the map, is leaning towards a Democratic trifecta or mixed government. We're still waiting on the results of that state. Next slide, please. Pulling out the Democratic trifectas, these states are the ones where we have the greatest opportunity to provide refuge for LGBTQ people and folks living with HIV, as well as to advance civil rights generally. As red states become increasingly more hostile, geography matters. People will need to travel to get the care and support that they need to live their lives, and not everyone can afford to travel hundreds of miles. So where the blue pops up on this map is going to matter to a lot of people. Next slide, please. So most people have heard of trifectas, but have you heard of a triplex? Triplexes are when the governor, the attorney general, and the secretary of state are all of the same party. And triplexes are actually more common than trifectas, and they matter because these folks interpret and enforce the law. When they're all on the same page, they can be quite effective both within and outside of their state. These are the people who will either go to court to challenge or preserve our rights. Next slide, please. And these are the states where we hope to have allies, either in the fight to outright or delay any federal efforts that are anti-LGBTQ or anti-people living with HIV. Next slide, please. And finally, state courts were also on the ballot. While many judges are appointed, quite a few are retained or elected through elections. My colleague Ethan Rice of our Fair Courts Project senior attorney, he tracks the composition of all 50 state Supreme Courts, and these are the results from election night. You're probably surprised to see purple states on this map, considering courts have an odd number of judges to avoid ties. But the purple states on this map, Nevada and Kentucky, both have nonpartisan elections and are split in ways that make it determine whether to determine there's a majority that has been appointed by one party or not on the court. And that is all that we know coming out of the election. I will pass the mic on to my colleague Jenny, who's going to talk about our plans for the future based on a lot of what the election gave us. Jenny.
Thank you, Kristine. Hi, everybody. Jenny Pizer. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Lambda Legal. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in our Western office in Los Angeles. So we have the entire country covered coast to coast for you today. And so I'm going to invite you to absorb a bit our 4-point plan, which I invite you to think about it as a framework for our work. It is not going to be, I'm afraid we can't give you a whole bunch of details about which lawsuits we're going to file when, partly because we don't, the new administration hasn't taken power yet, but also because that's not exactly how we plan our legal work. But we can give you a sense of the preparation we've done, which is a lot, and the framework for how we're going to deal with the crisis moment that we're in. And make no mistake, this is a crisis, and we have a hard road ahead of us. But it's our mission to protect LGBTQ plus people and people living with HIV from attacks. And we are in a time when we need to expect attacks. And so a couple of framing comments I would start with. I mean, the first point is that, as Kevin said, every crisis is different and requires us to do different things. But we have faced terrible crises before. We've been tenacious, we've been effective, and eventually we have prevailed. It has taken a lot of work, and it's taken some time, and it's taken resources. But we know we are facing now some of the same issues, many of the same issues that we've been dealing with in hostile states in recent years. The folks that oppose our community, that for religious reasons, for other kinds of reasons, including political expediency, have been attacking us in states at the point that they didn't have control at the federal level. Some of those same people are now going to go to the federal level, but we've been dealing with many of these issues. We're in court at this point with a docket of 70 cases, and many of those cases use the doctrines and the approaches and the evidence that we are probably going to need to deal with the attacks we now expect at the federal level. So we have a lot of preparation already, in addition to the preparation specifically that we did before this election. As Kevin said, we had a remarkable success rate against the policy proposals and attacks of the first Trump administration. We're very proud of that. And while that is no guarantee at all about what will happen in the future, it does mean that we're starting in a different place than we were last time. We have vast amounts of research. We have partnerships that were developed in our opposition work last time. Those relationships have nurtured and have participated in some of the litigation we're doing now against state attacks. We have a lot of relevant experience. So we're not starting in the same place we were last time. And I also want to acknowledge something, speaking of partnerships. Let's be real, that one of the biggest areas of attack that has been announced throughout this political campaign season is against immigrants, people thought to be immigrants, perceived as immigrants. We have to expect that there will be an effort to identify and deport people, to tear families apart, unlike anything we've seen, at least in recent times. Many of the people who will be vulnerable in that context are LGBTQ plus people, people living with HIV, people whose family members are LGBTQ plus or living with HIV. And we have many people in our country who have sought refuge here because of persecution in their country of origin. And many of those folks are going to be intensely vulnerable. So this will, of course, be an important area of our work, as it was during the first Trump administration. For our purposes also, we need to recognize that there's likely to be and should be a lot of attention to whatever tactics are used and the incredible harm that's going to be inflicted on people. It's likely to dominate the news. There may be less awareness, less attention to the ways that LGBTQ plus people are being attacked in other ways. But those attacks, make no mistake, they're going to be happening, and we're going to be following them, and we're going to be challenging them. So be aware, sometimes the news coverage doesn't reflect everything that's going on. In fact, rarely it does. So I want to invite you to take in our 4-point plan. I'm going to walk through the 4 elements of this framework. And in this context, keep in mind, it's a crisis. We recognize it's a crisis. Dealing with it is going to be hard. We need your help. We need more resources to do this work, and we need a lot more people helping us to deal with what we have ahead. So next slide, please. The first element of our planning here is to defend what we've gained. Drawing on our past successes, we will execute a policy and litigation strategy to offend the many civil rights advances made during the Biden administration and during the same period in many states. We're not going to give up easily the ground that we have gained. And so what does this mean? Well, some of it, to start, is a matter of perspective, because not everything is at risk of Trump action. And so I want to start with a couple of examples of some of the things that are secure at this point. The Biden administration successfully appointed and nominated and saw the confirmation of many federal judges. Not so many at the Supreme Court level, to be sure, but many federal judges. And of course, those folks, including double-digit numbers of openly lesbian or gay judges, not so much bisexual judges or trans judges or folks living openly with HIV. There's been an important improvement to the federal bench, and those positions are secure. We've had important wins through our litigation that should not be at risk. For example, we had multiple cases to win appropriate Social Security survivor benefits for people who were married to a same-sex spouse or did not have the opportunity to marry a same-sex spouse because of discriminatory marriage laws. We won those cases. Those benefits should be secure. There would be really unusual, problematic due process problems if that were to be attacked by the administration. The Respect for Marriage Act was passed by Congress and signed. Okay, if the Republicans hold both houses of Congress, theoretically, that statute could be attacked. But given the results at the ballot box and the overwhelming public support for marriage equality at this point, I don't think that's something we need to worry about at this point. The EEOC has significant independence. Many agencies are under control of the administration, but not so much the EEOC, which has been doing incredibly important work to make sure that workers know that the Supreme Court has recognized that existing federal employment protections, properly understood, forbid discrimination based on sexual orientation or transgender status. So there is good work that's been going on, and as a starting place, not everything is at risk, but some things likely will be at risk. And we are prepared to defend those advances. So, for example, we may again have to defend transgender folks who want to serve honorably and openly in our U.S. military. That's an area that we litigated successfully when Trump tweeted that trans folks should not be able to serve. They might try that again. We would be prepared to litigate that again. We've had success in court against irrational, archaic bans on people living with HIV being able to advance in a military career. And we have an ongoing case about whether people can enlist. Those successes in court should be secure. They were solid. They were well-reasoned. The Biden administration did not appeal some of them. So that's an area where if we have to relitigate it, we will. One more example in that area, we got improved rules for faith-based organizations that receive federal funding to serve members of the public. There had been capacious, problematic religious exemptions put in place by the Trump administration. We litigated and we got those rules significantly improved. We may see backsliding. We may see an attempt to reimpose licenses to discriminate with federal funds. And if that happens, we will have to deal with it. So I want to focus the last bit of attention on an area that is very meaningful for members of our community who are among the most vulnerable, and that is federal funding of programs that are there to take care of people in crisis, people in need. Many, many different types of programs. I mean, there's medical health care, of course, but disaster relief and housing and disability, rehabilitative services. Congress does have significant authority there. The administration has significant authority there. But if there are discriminatory budget riders that target LGBTQ plus people or people living with HIV, those are things that we might well need to challenge in court. The other area here for us to recognize is that we've made very significant progress in states, including increased access to gender-affirming medical care for transgender folks and insurance coverage for that care, improvements in people's ability to correct identity documents, friendly school environments with inclusive curricula, really important advances. We might see the federal government, the Trump administration, attempting to override and thwart some of those advances. And if that were to happen, those would all be areas where we would look pretty carefully and look to protect those advances. Those advances, of course, are important both because people need those services, people need to not have censorship and targeting in school, but also because that represents good public policy, and we need public policy to be advancing. So I want to give a couple of quick examples of the strategy that we use when the federal government, as we had lots of practice during Trump 1, how we deal with those attacks. The first area of attack is when an administration, and the Trump administration did this over and over again, proposes to change rules through the federal regulatory process. That means they propose a new rule and the public has an opportunity to comment. We submitted comments pointing out the problems with Trump rules 53 times. And again, after we submitted those comments, the bad rule came out and we sued. And because we and others had created an administrative record showing that the rule ignored science, ignored data, ignored governing federal law, ignored procedure, we had those excellent results again and again in court. As Kevin cited, we won 12 out of 14 of these cases. Areas that we will be looking, that we will be expecting to see attacks again. Religious exemptions, again, we had to litigate that in the healthcare area. We had good success there. Attacks on transgender folks, efforts to reinterpret sex discrimination to exclude and trans folks and permit discrimination, in particular in the medical area. Again, we had litigation there. And the third example I want to give you has to do with immigration and asylum. litigation there we did together with our good friends at Immigration Equality. We did comments, we showed the need, we showed the problems with what was being proposed, and then we had to sue, and we got a good result in court. So that's the regulatory arena. We also faced direct changes in policy by the administration, no regulatory process, where we just had to go directly into court. The two examples that I want to give there are censorship, when Trump issued an executive order forbidding within federal workplaces or private sector workplaces receiving federal contracts, training programs to address race discrimination, white supremacy, sexual harassment. This order deemed that type of training to be race and sex scapegoating. And that was an executive order. We sued and we got a court order blocking it. I mean, it's censorship. It violates the First Amendment, not appropriate, not okay. And we got that order blocked. Given the political rhetoric we've been hearing in the years since, we might see that kind of thing again. And then, as I mentioned, President Trump making military policy by tweet last time. We sued. There were other lawsuits as well. We had some good success there. So the takeaway about these attacks is that the zealotry and the arrogance of the Trump administration last time gave us good opportunities to block their proposals. They might be more careful this time, but this Project 2025 that I imagine folks are familiar with, it's had lots of news coverage, it's extreme. And many of the things being proposed and things being proposed by the Trump campaign as political matters are contrary to governing federal law. And as I said before, we've had intensive experience. So next slide, please. The next part of our framework here is building and expanding pro-equality safe zones. As Kristine showed with the map, we have very important safe zones in our country, and we will look forward to working with and continuing to work with pro-equality governors, attorneys general, state agencies, and local governments to defend LGBTQ plus rights. This will be a national effort. There will be states, again, as last time, challenging federal overreach, and we will look forward to working as partners with some of those states. We will also be giving ideas and in conversation and collaborating with state leaders about expanding LGBTQ plus protections. Some of that may be legislative, some of that may come through state executive orders and so forth. But the states remain, I mean, the phrase historically is laboratories of invention. Some of it is hostile and terrible. Some of it's really important and positive, and states will become that much more important as our partners in this time. Again, state funding can be a lifesaver for people. That is an area historically where federal law has discriminated, and some states have chosen, with respect to medical care in particular, to use state-specific funding to provide the care that people need, contrary to federal discrimination. We will look forward to being in those conversations. The other area where states already have taken important action, and I think more states will need to, is enacting what we call shield laws. They can come from the legislature, they can come from the state executive branch, but directing state authorities not to cooperate with hostile states that try to reach into states and impose discrimination, get information, to harass people, and interfere with people's ability to engage in lawful conduct within states that are supporting members of our community. Next slide, please. So I've talked already some about litigation, but let's be realistic about where we are. In terms of new attacks, we will work to leverage the courts as a last line of defense. The reality is that the executive branch, and at least one, if not both houses of Congress, are in the hands of folks who have had many policies that affirmatively discriminate, would like to make our community members invisible, would like to make us disappear. And in many places, the courts will be our only hope for stopping or at least delaying the significant harms to members of our community. This is a key part of what Lambda Legal exists to do. So I want to give just a couple of examples quickly of areas where we are already preparing. Again, I keep mentioning the area of immigration and asylum, but that is because that has been identified as an area where we expect to see not just federal authority used to target people, including many, many people who have legal status here, but that are going to be targeted based on appearance, based on language. But the federal government, when this happened before, tried to enlist state and local authorities to be additional machinery for going after folks within our country. And so we need to have this as a priority, but let's recognize that we will be working together with people who have this expertise. A lot of this is going to create a kind of terror for all sorts of people, and it is an important part of our job to stand against that, to protest that. We can expect to see it in other areas as well, but I think the intentional cruelty and aggressiveness that's being that we're hearing about immigrants and people that may be perceived as immigrants is a signal of what we can expect in lots of different areas. And medical care access to whether it is gender affirming care, whether it's reproductive health care, whether it's PrEP, whether it's all sorts of other things. We are living in a time where the attacks on doctors and families, parents, are unlike anything I've seen in recent times. So this will continue to be a key area. Some people will be needing to travel to access care. Some people will be trying to access care through telemedicine. I think there will be a range of ways that we and other members of our movements will be working to protect people. We will also be needing to do direct legal challenges to some of these cruel actions. As I said before, censorship, weaponizing the federal government, some of this will be just aggressive changes of policy, and we will be prepared to go to court. Some people are talking about how the IRS may be used. We have seen that in the past, whether that's effort to take away organizations' 501c3 status or do certain kinds of audits. Maybe the Department of Justice may be used in discriminatory ways. We are anticipating such things, and we are preparing for such things. It's not just the federal courts, though. And as Kristine pointed out, there are courts that remain fair and open, and we imagine that they will be receptive to our claims. We have been litigating in state courts quite a bit. Some of the attacks by state actors on members of our community, we have litigated within the state courts because state power is being misused. State laws are being violated, and state courts often are a good place, even courts that are often conservative, often hostile to certain types of claims. The judges are clear, for example, that the consumer fraud laws are not the same thing as malpractice laws. These are different areas of law, and if they're misused, we have had some good success in state courts. Next slide, please. The fourth part of our framework here is recognizing the long-term nature of our work. Again and again, members of our community have been used for political purposes, to whip up fear, to demonize us. Anita Bryant, for some of you who study history, John Briggs here in California, with false and terribly damaging claims about gay men as being sexual predators. It took us considerable time to educate the public that that was just a pernicious lie. During the marriage campaigns, there were lies about same-sex couples as parents, and it took us time to educate the public. In 2004, many constitutional amendments passed in states. There has been some analysis that suggests that is part of how George W. Bush got a second term. We had to do a lot of educational work. And now we have very strong supermajority support for marriage equality. We have to do similar work again now. The American public needs to know who transgender folks are, who non-binary folks are, that none of this is a threat to anybody. it does take a minute to do that work. We know how to do that work. We do that work in our litigation. We do it in our policy advocacy. We do it in all of our public education. We just need to do more of it. We already are doing it, as are our partners in this movement, and our legal partners in particular. But make no mistake, we just need to do a lot more of it because people's lives depend on it. The attacks that we've seen, the way trans folks have been used in such cruel and unrelenting ways by the Trump campaign, it's just appalling. It's unconscionable. It's caused a lot of harm. So we and our partners feel the urgency to do this public education because people are really suffering, and it's not okay. But I want to add to the context here. We're talking about our community members, which is a key part of our responsibility to protect, in the context of the long-term systemic change that we need to do. The system reform, that includes court reform, it includes democracy reform. Never forget that our opponents took more than half a century to get the reversal of Roe v. Wade, to change the makeup of the federal courts, for that goal to get rid of affirmative action as part of our constitutional law, to change the Second Amendment into a deadly tool, to make all kinds of changes that we've seen in recent times. It is part of our mission as a legal organization to educate our communities about the essential nature to reform the courts, to restore voting rights, to do a range of types of system reform. This will not be done in a day or a year. It's long-term work, but Lambda Legal has been here for half a century. We've gone through cycles of change, cycles of success, some setbacks, and we've persisted. If we have to do it for another 50 years, that is what we're here to do, including the system reform with the urgency of today to protect as many members of our community as we can, with our creativity, with our skill, with our partners. Last slide, please. This 4-point plan is the result of months of thinking, of years of work, of collaboration, and of planning. With your help, with the additional resources that we can gather, we will implement this plan, and we will continue to be prepared. We will not win every case. We will not win every fight, but we will fight, and we will defend our people. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you. I think we can go to the next slide. So to return to the subject I ended with, first of all, thank you, Kristine and Jenny, for excellent presentations. I personally find them very reassuring, and I'm sure many people on this call do as well. We can anticipate a lot of what the Trump administration might do, but we can't anticipate all of it. So we are seeking to raise $1 million by December 31st to have an emergency response fund so that we have funds to face whatever is thrown at us. And we are ready to combat whatever kinds of hostile acts are taken. As you probably know, Lambda Legal is currently litigating in 31 states and the District of Columbia. Our team is stretched very thin, and additional resources would be enormously helpful to us as we plan for what is going to be probably a very challenging 4 years ahead. So if there's a QR code on your screen, if you're able to give at any level, we would be very grateful for that. We thank you for your support, which makes our work possible. And with that, I'm going to bring our presentation to a close. I do want to mention, before I do so, though, that we do have Lambda Legal's help desk. It is the only national legal help desk which provides support to people who have experienced discrimination based on gender identity, HIV status, or sexual orientation. If you know people who are experiencing discrimination, please send them to our help desk, where our attorneys will seek to do whatever we can to support them.
And Kevin, if I might, I apologize, but there's one more slide that we want to show people. This is, we are in the Supreme Court. We are in the Supreme Court on a case that we wanted to have in the Supreme Court. We think it is the best among quite a few choices to ask the Supreme Court to look at the issue of discrimination against transgender folks and to apply the appropriate constitutional standard. And if the if the case goes as we think we have a decent chance of it going, it will be incredibly helpful to an enormous amount of our work. So December 4th, U.S. Supreme Court, rally on the court steps, oral arguments inside the court. We're ready to roll.
Thank you for joining us. Please stay in touch. We're going to need your support and your continued help over the next 4 years. As we have for 51 years, Lambda Legal will fight for the rights of LGBTQ plus people and everyone living with HIV. We are not stopping now. Have a good afternoon.